Hi, I'm Kat Rosenfield.
And I'm Phoebe Maltz Bovy, and together we are Feminine Chaos. Thank you for joining us once more, and welcome to any new viewers we might have. So today we are going to talk about a few different topics. The first is representation of all sorts, literary representation, representation on screen, not representation as in representation of objects, but representation as in feeling represented or not feeling represented in books, movies, TV shows, and so forth. What that means, what it has to mean, how necessary it is, how necessary it always is. And we will resolve once and for all such questions as, can art ever be universal? And must fiction depict a world exactly like, or perhaps kinder than, the world we actually live in? So we expect to have this fully resolved.
Yeah, we're gonna work it all out for everybody else's benefit.
Absolutely. So Kat, when has this come up recently, this question of representation in the arts?
So the big pop culture moment for this concept has been Captain Marvel, which debuted, I guess it was a week and a half ago, the weekend of like March 8th. And it's very exciting because it is the first standalone female-led movie in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And as has been the case frequently with movies that have women at their center, it became kind of a bigger than itself flashpoint in the culture wars, which is something that I wrote about a little bit for Playboy this past week. And essentially it sort of trod the same path that happened with Ghostbusters, the all-female Ghostbusters reboot, where you had, this kind of kick-ass woman in a movie, and then in this case Brie Larson, the star, said some slightly controversial, maybe a little bit tone-deaf things about not caring what white men think about movies that have women in them. Did you not know about that?
No, I will confess to being complete Marvel ignoramus and have learned about this through you.
Yeah, okay. So she said this slightly tone-deaf thing that, attracted angry attention from a small handful of aggrieved men who then decided that they were going to try to single-handedly campaign to tank the movie's ratings pre-release. And as is typical, and as we've discussed on previous Feminine Chaoses, it resulted in the trolls getting way more attention than they deserved. It was like, a lot of people on Twitter are saying journalism centered on like 3 random angry nobodies saying some dumbass thing. And as a result, the movie became this big feminist flashpoint. And suddenly it was, you need to buy your ticket opening weekend if you're a woman or you're a bad feminist. We're going to war. It's girls against boys. And at some point, obviously representation became a big part of this conversation. The idea being that this movie was particularly special for women because it is the only MCU movie for us, because it's the only movie that has a standalone female superhero at its center, which, for the record, is a concept that I am not entirely on board with.
Well, let's discuss so representation is both, so it's 2 things. It's representation amongst characters, and then there's this whole separate question of representation professionally, like who actually works in different industries. And they're related, but they're different questions.
Yeah.
What we seem to keep coming back to on this is, at least, I'll speak for myself, you may agree with this, that there's a lot of value in there being representation in who's actually in these industries, but that once it comes to policing the content itself is where things can get a little less interesting. But so let's talk though about this Marvel. And so you don't think that girls need Brie Larson specifically?
No. And oh God, this is, So this is a conversation that makes people very emotional, as I discovered when I tried to bring it up online. And actually, before we go any further, I should just like do a little disclosure here. I wrote a book last year with Stan Lee, who is kind of the father of Marvel, before he passed away in November. So I do have a personal, professional investment in things comic book related and comic book adjacent, just to kind of get that out there. But I'm not affiliated with this movie in any way. So the thing about the representation argument is that, people start saying like they always invoke their children, or children in general, in a way that kind of reminds me of the woke toddler memes that were circulating around like the 2016 election, where people were claiming to have ththese sort of belief-begging interactions with their 5-year-olds.
Daddy, why can't a woman be president?
Yeah. All of these kids had remarkably sophisticated progressive politics somehow. But it's sort of the same thing where people, when you try to bring this up and you say, like, is representation actually vitally important for the reasons that are being suggested here? People will say things like, well, if you had seen the awe and joy in my child's eyes when she first saw Wonder Woman on the big screen, like, you wouldn't dare question the awesome power of representation. And it's tough to have a conversation with somebody who's approaching things from that angle, just because, it is very emotional and not super founded in logic. You just can't have a critical discussion about it.
Well, you start to feel, so I think I may be more, and I'm a woke toddler. No, I think I see the value of of representation in that sense to a degree, and I'll get into that in a moment. But I think that what you're talking about here is partly that it's hard to argue with somebody who has invoked their toddler or their young child in general, because whatever they're saying, you don't be like yelling at a little child,
right? Like, why are you a monster who hates children? Like, why do you want to crush children's joy? So
exactly. Yeah. So I think you can disagree on these things, but that once somebody has done that, it's hard. Yeah.
But the conversation that I would love to have about this is not about the value of representation overall, because I think there's actually a very solid ethical, moral argument to be made for it, but it's really based in a concept of fairness that stems from like, who gets to work on these movies? Who gets to be part of telling these stories? It's $1 billion industry. There's no reason it should be homogenous. Everybody should have access to working here. And that's what I think, the argument is in favor of representation. The one that's not the one that really comes up that much. Instead, you get this kind of magical, the awesome power, like children need to see themselves on screen, because if you can't see it, you can't be it. Which, sounds good. It rhymes, got this kind of like homespun truthiness to it. But it raises questions for me about, is this actually how we engage with fiction? Like, is the primary entry point for people who enjoy watching movies or who enjoy reading novels that they're searching for themselves in this superficial, like, census identity checkbox way in the text or on the screen?
So what you wrote about the tweets that I remember about this, you were saying basically that has not been your own experience of...
No, it definitely hasn't. And I'm coming at this more as a reader. I wasn't really allowed to watch a lot of TV when I was a kid, but I read a lot of books. So I was thinking about all of the adventure stories that I loved. And a lot of them were about boys. Pretty much all of them were written by men. And it never would have occurred to me that I couldn't relate to these stories because the characters were male instead of female, especially because a lot of them, the things that I did relate to, and I thought prior to stepping in it on Twitter that this was the case for most people, was that they were resonant themes for me. Things about the characters that kind of transcended anything as basic as gender or race or, any of those various markers.
Mm-hmm. I think that makes sense. I think, so I'm going to be the woke toddler here, as I said. And I guess, I think part of what happens when there are not very many people of various backgrounds could be in the census category sense, and also in things that transcend census category. Just whenever it's kind of monolithic who's producing any type of art. Because of this, in sort of indirectly, you get only certain, like, it will be, let's say, like mainly white boys, white men will be represented in some genre. And then what ends up happening is you get a sort of well-meaning progressive attempt at addressing this that says that you have to like this specific work, or else you do not like this specific demographic. And that's where that's where I'm the very unwoke toddler. And I say, no, that's never the case. And that's something that has bothered me seriously. Like, I'm going to woke toddler myself here. I'm not kidding. Since I was a kid, it has bothered me when people have said you have to like such and such book, such and such movie, if you care about this cause, this group of people. And I think that's always ridiculous. Even if there's insufficient representation, it's never that you have to like a particular work, because some works are just crap or they don't resonate with you for whatever, So I think that in that sense, I don't think it's great. I do think, though, like in terms of my own, I'll talk about my own cultural consumption that's a little bit all over the place. I definitely, I identify with the Seinfeld character of George Costanza a lot. I think like there are just all sorts of moments that I think about like every day. There are like little George moments where I like really get it. They're just like, and I'm not going to give specific examples because it's just like damning, it's like, it's too much of a liability, to say like, well, there was that one and that one. I'm not, moment by moment George Costanza, but I feel that. But then again, I also always really identified with Rhoda on the Mary Tyler Moore Show. So I was allowed to watch a fair amount of television. And Rhoda was like the Jewish one, the Jewish sidekick on the Mary Tyler Moore Show, even though not played by a Jewish actress. So that would maybe be problematic today, or maybe not. Maybe. Nobody can ever decide if Jews count for that. But I don't find it problematic that Valerie Harper played Rhoda. But anyway, the point is, I totally identified there for these more census box type reasons, but also culturally. I mean, it wasn't just like, oh, they've decided to say that this character is Jewish, therefore I identify. What I will say I've also experienced, though, with cultural consumption, and this is more as an adult, is when I'll pick up some novel like at a used bookstore just randomly and think, oh, I've heard of that one or something. The one that's coming to mind most for this, although there's a lot, but would be Fear of Flying.
Is that Erica Jong?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Where I'll pick up some novel and I'll just think, oh, I've heard of this. And I'll start reading and it'll be like, it's this young Jewish woman, and oh, here she is in New York, and here she is doing this, and here she is doing that, and here she is at NYU doing her graduate program or something. And I'm like, oh my God, this is my life. Like, this is too close. And it's like where I'm put off by identifying so much with the main character in these sort of tick the box senses. And also I feel like there's no point in me ever writing anything because it's already probably been done. But anyway, I do see the value of seeing yourself in the sense of like, it's not so much that these works are doing something. And this comes back to this question of like what you need from art, like what art should be doing. If art is reminding children, just for the purposes of this conversation, children that the world, or teaching children that the world is unfair in certain respects, and that certain people are just deemed the default human in a way that others are not, it's upsetting. I guess the question though is, should art be presenting things other than how they are, and how does that square with this whole notion of authenticity and of having to present things exactly as they are?
Yeah, that's kind of like a new wrinkle. Although I'm about to like trip over myself here because I've been working on something that's not out yet about kind of the valuing of authenticity and how it's a kind of a flashpoint for conflict in the world of YA fiction.
very interested in advance.
Yeah. So, to be continued on that front. But the thing that kind of strikes me, and I just want to say for the record, lest I get myself in trouble again, that I don't disagree, with your take on this. I think that, it's kind of it's just it's a complicated subject. The idea, do children need role models? Yes, of course they do. Are role models the primary point of engagement for, getting into a story and being moved by it? I don't know. Mm-hmm. Not always, certainly.
Oh, certainly not. Yeah.
I mean, I'm just thinking the one show that I was allowed to watch as a kid was the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And I can't stop thinking about how, at the time, the character I identified with most was not April, the female journalist, strangely enough.
Oh, no.
But Raphael, the incredibly emo, cranky turtle who, was a hormonal teenager who hated everybody. So, yeah. There's just so many... It's such as a kid, the way that you relate to this stuff, I think, is very different from once you become an adult and you have more kind of political concerns and you have this conception of your identity that is rooted maybe more in, the check boxes.
Well, this is where I'm going to disagree a bit, because I think I, even as a kid, definitely had a sense, and I was telling you about this earlier, in terms of this is going to make me seem really very intellectual, but in terms of fashion models, I had a sense as a kid that fashion models did not look like me and that this was somehow significant. Now, they, at that point, were not younger than I am, which is now the most salient thing for me about them, is that they are half my age. But certainly that I'm 5'2". I knew I would never be that tall. I knew I would never have that build, but also, they never, and this has changed, I think, with stuff like Broad City, that there are sort of, and this gets into another whole sinkhole of topics, but there are sort of stereotypically Jewish looking women, let's say, which anybody can be Jewish, but there's such a thing as stereotypically Jewish looking that it has to do with how you are received in society. And I'm not going to, say such a thing doesn't exist. And basically it didn't exist among fashion models. And I would not see, so this is, I don't even want to say that it's nothing compared to what.
Sure. I mean,
but I think it's it's a type, it's something that, so I can understand even as a kid relate, having these sorts of concerns and maybe not being able to articulate them. And
I think that this is about the difference between realizing something about beauty standards and something about the fashion industry, which is grounded in reality and not so much about how you relate it to a fictional character.
Right. So with fictional characters, I mean, I think where it overlaps would be anything visual. So TV, movies, all of this, I think there's some overlap. I think in terms of novels, I mean, I loved it, and I didn't quite get it as much when I did a bit more reading of this more recently, but the Adrian Mole books. I love those. I did not identify in any cultural sense with this character, so yeah, I think once you're out of a visual realm, it's something quite different. But I have a different whole thing about the book angle though, which is that, so the way I arrived at my topic in grad school was noticing, so I wrote about French Jews, especially in the 19th century, in a French lit grad program. And where I ended up with this really was in all my classes in college and stuff, we would be reading French novels and plays and poems, everything, and there would often be this character, the Jew, who would be this hook-nosed moneylender always, or something like this. And it just, but the thing is, I guess, so where this gets, how to put this, it definitely seemed, so this was not as a child, this was as an adult that I was, young adult, but, adult all the same, it was 18, 19. It definitely seemed important to me, but it also didn't make me think that I should have anything to do with the content of the books, that I should be controlling what's in books, if that makes sense. It seemed more that this was a reflection of culture, a reflection of a society, and that you learn about how a society is through this. And I guess what's strange to me watching things play out sort of in real time when it's not about 19th century literature is is the answer, which some in the 19th century thought it was too, where they would write these books where, and I'm not going to go too far into this because this was my exact dissertation topic, so I don't want to but where there would be these plays and novels where a Jew and a Catholic would fall in love and it would be beautiful, but they would face obstacles. There was virtually no intermarriage at this time in France. These books were about the world as it should be, according to the authors, according to French liberals at the time.
Oh, interesting.
So I guess as I ramble here, I would say that some of it is that these are not entirely new questions. I think it's more what's new is this notion of, and this, I guess, is kind of coming full circle on some of this notion of thinking of literature in terms of rules and in terms of what's permitted. And I think that's where I think our agreement on this topic most especially really lies, is this notion that telling people you can't write about X or you have to write about X, that's not literature anymore of any sort. That, that's just that, I don't know, like that's a textbook.
Right. Well, what's interesting to me is that I feel like a lot of the current focus on this idea of authenticity and lived experience stems, at least in part, from something that was a big deal when I was working in publishing a million years ago, back in the early 2000s, which was people didn't want to read novels at that point. It was like, we want memoirs. Memoir was the big thing. And people wanted, it was like the idea that a story was true was just everything. It somehow made it more valuable. The problem was that all it did was incentivize these people who were incredible storytellers, also incredible liars, to just fabricate. You had like James Fry and J.T. Leroy, people just making shit up. And right. It was interesting to me at the time because you are seeing kind of a similar thing happening now in terms of like the idea of like own voices novels, where, identity is everything, that people like to think they can tell when a story is true or when a story is authentic, but we're actually, like, as human beings, we're not that good at it. And you have people now, kind of pulling a fast one, adopting the identity of a marginalized person.
That guy, the white man who was like a Chinese poet.
Yeah, he was. Yes, exactly. He
don't remember either his name or the fake name, but I remember the story because it was.
Yeah, I remember. Ironically, what I remember is that he ended up under his Chinese female pseudonym, getting selected for like a best of poetry anthology,
right,
curated by Sherman Alexie, who was
very problematic,
right? So I mean,
yes,
if Sherman Alexie can't tell, like
nobody can tell, and this is one of these, another like 19th century France thing, that when fiction started being serialized in newspapers, this is one of my favorite things I learned in grad school, is that people didn't know that it was fiction. And I think that continues. I think this, people thought they were just reading news stories because it was in a newspaper. But I think what happens in this sort of discourse, such as it is that two things backfire in terms of so like even sharing the general sort of progressive aims on this, it seems like the tactics fall apart in two places. One, I think, is this notion, what you're saying with own voices, it pretty much makes it so that, practically speaking, there are going to be fewer characters with any traits other than, white, straight, middle class, or wealthy man. You know what I mean? If any otherness needs to be coming from, or a woman maybe, but if any otherness needs to be by somebody who has that exact identity, it privileges non-marginalized characters, basically, or you know what I mean? So I think that's one issue. So if the point is for children to see themselves represented, but they're only allowed to be represented by creators of the exact background, it's just going to reduce, because if people from marginalized backgrounds, of whom there are too few already in these industries to begin with, but if they can do either, and the not so marginalized people can only can only represent themselves, is just going to mean fewer characters of color, fewer gay characters, and so forth, so that's one issue. But it seems like another, and this is sort of like a bigger picture issue, is that it just separates things out between, like, I think it encourages this notion of universal art that's exclusionary, because it makes it so that there's, on the one hand, diverse books, the books that we're celebrating this month, for whichever, like, this is Women's History Month, whatever, to give an example, where I would be the, my identity group, whatever it is. And then there's, on the other hand, literature, like the real literature, the universal literature that anybody might relate to. And then that gets sort of left again somehow for white men more, so it's like the ways of challenging it can actually kind of reinforce the very things. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And this kind of comes full circle back to the whole Captain Marvel thing, where it's like you start talking about who's represented, and suddenly you're not talking about who's represented, but you're talking about who the story is for, which only serves to shut out people who aren't necessarily represented from all of the other, it's like, if Captain Marvel is not for men and it's just for women, then who is Captain America not for? Is it, are women not allowed to enjoy that? And are we then suddenly confined to only the movies that contain female heroes? If so, that would be kind of a travesty, because the thing about Captain Marvel, I mean, actually, I should say I haven't seen it, but I've heard that it's actually a kind of a mediocre superhero movie, which should be fine. We should be able to, like, as women, we should be able to have mediocre superhero movies featuring women. Like, it shouldn't be the thing that kind of like, people say, like, oh, this movie was mediocre, hence we can never make another female superhero movie again. But yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think the answer is just more representation among creators, less, in fact, ideally, no fussing about the content itself in that regard, no sort of policing of content.
Yeah, there's just no good way to do it, I think.
No. But I just, before I forget, there's one instance where I felt very seen, and I have to mention it because it always cracks me up whenever I see, you will see why, whenever I see a manhole cover like this up. So have you watched Broad City ever?
I haven't, no.
Okay. So it's about these two sort of broke millennial Jewish girls living in Brooklyn, living out my exact recent first year of college year. No, not exactly. But that's not the part that I really identify with, because there are a lot of aspects of the show that I don't. Mm-hmm. But the part that I do is the character Alana goes with her mother to these sample sales, and it's like, I would go with my mother to sample sales, but because it's this absurd TV show, the sample sales, for them, it's like, I guess, or it's like they're getting these handbags, and the handbags are being like, it's like some dealer who's like down a manhole. And then there's this line that I think it's Alana's mother, I'm forgetting the name of the actress, but she's amazing. She's also in Curb Your Enthusiasm. Says the best stuff's always down a manhole. But the reason this is clever is that the other plot with Abby, the other main character in the show, involves a manhole of a different nature. It's
okay.
I won't get into it further, but I mean, it's like a TV show. It's not terribly, well, I guess it's a bit.
Are we talking about like I just want to be clear. Are we talking about like an orifice? Like
yes.
Okay.
It's the pegging episode.
Okay. But that one. That's a classic. Everyone knows the pegging episode.
Certainly. But anyway, the point is, it's just this very funny line about where there's like these literal manhole covers under which they sell these fake designer handbags. But anyway, the whole thing about like that type of New York shopping, mm-hmm. where you're like looking for these deals in these odd places, was like, on the one hand, you say, fine, it's not like New York or Jews have been like not represented on television before. But this was so specific and so sort of Jewish women specific.
Mm-hmm.
Not that only Jewish women go to sample sales, and certainly not that these things actually exist under manhole covers on Canal Street or wherever. But there was just something about that dynamic that just seemed like very specific. So what I'm saying with this is that I get why it can be fun to be seen on that very specific level. I also don't think that that's the only way people of any age take in art.
Right. I mean, as I'm listening to you talk about this, like this could not be further from my own upbringing, which was, in a cow town.
You weren't going down manholes looking for handbags.
No. We didn't, we didn't have a place to shop for handbags. But it still sounds really entertaining. Like, I don't feel that, that this is unrelatable. It's not, it's not like I would say, oh, this is my life, but it sounds funny, it sounds
absolutely. And I think when I think of the, books and movies and such that I've most enjoyed, I have not related to them on that same sort of exact personal experience level. And I find that there's a certain, like, this was what I was getting at with those novels, where this has to do somewhat with my cultural background, having been plenty represented, in these sort of specific ways a lot of the time, is sometimes I get more out of something where I don't feel like I can exactly picture which block that happened on. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
I don't know. Like, for me, Universal requires that almost.
Yeah. I mean, it's nice. There's just like, multiple entry points into all of these stories that, make them relatable on all kinds of different levels, I think is.
So we're thinking that there can be universal art.
I mean, I don't know. I think
like applicable across transcending demographic.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the thing is that, the reason why, for instance, I mean, when I was a kid, I loved these books by John Bellairs, which were about a 13-year-old boy in the 50s battling supernatural forces with the help of his elderly next door neighbor, who was like this kind of old crotchety professor. And I still found these books incredibly resonant, just because the main character was kind of like weird and quiet and nerdy. And I was all of these things. And despite sharing nothing else with him, I really felt that these books were for me on a fundamental level.
Well, I think I'm persuaded. That makes sense. And I don't see why that's controversial, but Twitter is a strange place.
Twitter is a strange place. But, I like to be optimistic about the idea that art can, even if there's no such thing as a story that everyone loves, that clearly there are all of these stories that people relate to across the census box boundaries. Yeah,
I mean, I think definitely the answer is not in sort of shutting things off, and just, I think, is more in opening up more pathways to creating and consuming art.
Yes. And there's been no better time to, to open up all of those pathways and to, invite people of all backgrounds in. It's like, every streaming service also has become a studio, and there's just a lot of room.
I never would have thought in a million years I would have anything to do with a video cast, and yet here we are.
Yeah, amazing.
So should we talk about, do you have more on representation?
No, I think we've pretty much.
I think we have.
We solved it. I
think we did. And the only other thoughts I have would be a rambling 5-hour monologue about Seinfeld and what it meant to me growing up. And I'm going to skip that, but maybe Arya.
For the bonus material.
Yeah, definitely. So we're going to talk a little bit. Do we have time, you think? Privilege?
Yeah, we have time.
Yeah, let's do it. Okay. So, as some of you may know, I wrote a book about privilege. This is a topic that always interests me, and there's some part of my brain that doesn't know the book came out in March of 2017 and is done, and I'm not still writing it, because I'm still both finding amazing examples of things to do with this topic, and people keep sending them to me. Just when I think I'm done with it, there's the topic again. And boy, has it ever been in the news recently, the topic of privilege to do with this college admissions fraud scandal bonkers thing in which some wealthy people with Full House and Target affiliations of some sort and others have been found to have bribed their not particularly academic children or athletic to get into school on the basis of academic and athletic feats that they have not in fact accomplished. Yeah, that's it.
You just said they bribed their children, which I don't
no, not their
quite...
bribed their children. I have not. Okay, so I have not slept a full night in a really long time. So they definitely, I'm going to bribe my infant to sleep through the night and then but yes, they bribed the schools. They bribed administrators, coaches, different people to proctor a test, all sorts of things. So basically they paid for their kids to get into colleges.
Sometimes not even like super prestigious colleges. That's the kind of funny thing.
Yeah, that was, they didn't always get their money's worth.
Yeah, well, the one who was going to USC, who, like, on top of everything, had absolutely no interest whatsoever in going to college at all.
Oh, and, I know. I almost feel for the kids in some of these situations, because it's like, I've known people like this where, like, their college isn't for them, but their families think it. Surely people like us send their children to college, and then it's, I mean, there's worse fates. There are worse fates. But anyway, yeah, so that's why privilege has been in the news recently, because this has led to this whole sort of cultural conversation about, but isn't everyone just buying their, like, not everyone, and that's, well, the question is, where do you draw the line? But aren't a lot of people just kind of in one way or another buying their children's way into these schools? Isn't it just the whole system that's rotten, this being only just a kind of exaggerated version of what's just happening in general? So that's where I think that sort of many of the takes on this story have been coming from. So rather than looking at this as a kind of bizarre thing that isn't really representative of anything other than, you know, status seeking among people without too many ethical qualms, that, you know, is this just an indictment of the whole system of college admissions in the US?
And what do you think? Is it?
Well, so I think a few different things about this scandal. So first, I think it's absolutely, like, I guess the main thing that made me think about is, first off, I don't think that this is just like everybody's buying their way and it's all exactly the same. I think it's different to bribe people than to, like, I think you have to have a kind of common sense place you're drawing the line about these things, and that I think everything is privilege that's privilege. And if your parents didn't have much but encouraged you to study and pushed you towards the section of the library that has the SAT review books, well, guess what? Somebody else's parents didn't do that. You know, somebody else was caring for their sick parents who were not helping them in any way. You know what I mean? So there's all these different nuances. And I think one place I think some of these takes didn't quite get it was in sort of conflating these very, very different sort of both levels of privilege and levels of unethical behavior. So I don't think it's all the same in that sense. But I think that what it made me think of most, though, is really this issue with college admissions where the people who are sort of middle class, I guess, often white, although not necessarily, often, and this is something I did write about in my book, will blame not getting into the colleges of their choice on people who are less privileged, and will say, oh, well, you know, my spot was taken. They'll say, you know, like and again, I'm speaking in the voice of, I'm happy with where I went to college. I haven't thought about it much lately because I'm, you know, old, but basically where they'll say, oh, you know, if I had a sob story, if I were from this background or that background, I would have gotten in. What they're missing, people of that demographic, is that no, the reason they didn't get in is because there are people even more privileged who took their spots. And the reason they didn't get in isn't because they're privileged, it's because they're not privileged enough. And I feel like that's something that gets kind of ignored and talking about this all in terms of privilege, in terms of sort of these, in this very broad way, misses how the system advantages people who are like really, really, really privileged, if that makes sense.
Well, I mean, I was really struck in the conversation about this by I can't remember if it was like an excerpt from some like court transcript or something, but where it was some guy saying, look, this isn't like, you know, on the up and up, like where you buy a building so they let your kid into school, you know, or you give millions of dollars for a building. Like this was a straight up bribe. And it's like, how, I mean, yes. Okay. On the other hand, yes, I understand why, you know, doing something illegal is different from doing something legal. But the idea that one of these things is therefore tasteful and normal and the other one is like beyond the pale.
Exactly. I think it is showing basically that the system is corrupt in that way. I think the problem is that people are talking about it at completely the wrong scale, if that makes sense. Like this notion that if only people whose parents, you know, if only everybody who didn't have a completely miserable childhood were to properly acknowledge their privilege, then that would solve it. No, college is incredibly expensive. Even public colleges are incredibly expensive in the States. Mm-hmm. The whole thing is expensive. And it's also this story of somebody arriving at college only to realize that all of their classmates are really rich. This is not because in the States, everybody is either, you know, from a really scrappy background or really rich. It's because that's how these colleges kind of arrange things. They don't really have middle class students because they have this many really, really rich students, basically, is the, anyway, like someplace like Harvard. This was something, I don't remember the exact statistics. It's somewhere in my book, but because I wrote about this, but like the family incomes are really high, like $500,000 or something is like common, or I don't remember, but it's US dollars, I should say, because not even the Canadian dollar. Those fun ones I earn, and not even so many of them. But yeah, I think the system has problems, but I feel like too often what results is like this kind of weird self-flagellating from people who either aren't even particularly privileged, or, and then there was that Quillette article that I have not read, but that I like clicked on, that was about Zoe Kazan. Is this right?
I don't think I saw that one.
Well, something about how because I had seen her tweets about this, where she's acknowledging that her upper middle class parents paid for a tutor for her. And I had like quote tweeted this and was like, that's not at all the same thing as like either buying a building or bribing your way into college, like paying for a tutor. I mean, people do this who are not super wealthy, you know, they save up and pay for a tutor. That's a thing that happens. It's not quite the same scale. But then I guess I hadn't put this together, but I guess she's from a famous family. And
Elia Kazan's
yes,
I don't know how you pronounce his name. But yes, I think she's his granddaughter.
Well, that's different from the parents spent, you know, they saved up and put $500 aside once for her to have some tutoring sessions.
Right.
I mean, it's a different
like,
scale.
If you're going to acknowledge something, it's funny that you would choose to do the tutoring thing and not the famous.
That is what I believe. I have not. Yeah, I need to go back and look at this because it's up my alley, as they say. But I don't know. I think it's good that people are talking about it, but I think where I really don't want to see this go is like for colleges to really reckon with it and hire administrators who will help them reckon with the privilege on the campuses, and to really like make sure that it's only the people buying the buildings who get in, or you know what I mean? Like it just seems like there's a lot of bad ways this could be addressed, and that just making the schools cheaper would be like,
that would be a good one. Hiring more administrators, which will only inevitably make the schools more expensive, probably not the best solution.
Right. So I guess this whole thing with privilege, like it seems to live on, and there just keep being these other instances of it that are really juicy. But I don't know, do you have other thoughts on the college admissions aspect of it?
I honestly, I don't have a ton of thoughts on this story. It's so, the whole thing is so far removed from anything that I'm remotely familiar with. You know, I haven't been in college in like almost 20 years, and yeah.
Fair enough. And well, I'm on maternity leave now, but I teach in Canada, and it's a very different system. And I don't know, but I don't think celebrities are buying their way into Canadian universities. But if they are, I'm sure I'll be the first to hear about it.
I don't know. I mean, the only thing that I remember about Canadian universities is that when I was looking at schools, it was like, you know, you could go to McGill and it would be really inexpensive as compared with,
yes.
And this was like in the late 90s. So
yes, I definitely remember applying to McGill, and I remember that they did not require an essay.
Oh,
so I'm in favor. I don't like college essays, so I want to go back in time and go to McGill, but I can't. Yeah. But the other, so there have been just like a bunch of privilege things that I've found kind of that relate to this in various ways, where people keep like acknowledging their privilege at silly moments, or people are keeping urged to acknowledge their privilege when that's sort of the least of it. But I guess the thing that relates most to the college admissions thing is that there have been a couple articles recently, one in Harper's Bazaar, the women's magazine, and another in the New York Times about like 30-somethings who get, you know, their bills paid by their parents, which I know it's out there. It's not out there personally.
Right.
But
the interesting one was it wasn't just their bills being paid, but it was like their entree into the real estate market. Right. That was the one that I was kind of like, ooh, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think what happens there is there's this, what frustrates me about articles like that is that they keep concluding the same thing, which is that the problem is transparency, and that the problem is that you have secret rich friends. And I feel like, yeah, that's annoying when people are secretly rich, but the problem is the wealth inequality itself, and the not being able to, you know, live somewhere near where you work, and all of this. And I feel like too often, and like that came up in both of those articles, it becomes about like, if only my rich friend told me how rich they really were. And then there was also just this, due to like something about the college admission scandal, where this was a New York Times op-ed, where the writer was saying that when she had attended Cornell as a first-generation college student, some other student there said something like, "Oh, I'm here because I'm a legacy." And that sounded really obnoxious, but it was an acknowledgement of privilege. Is right. That, you know, like the problem is the unfair system. It's not the manners of, you know, I mean, it can be the manners, but that's not enough to like address having really, really kind, rich people doesn't really do anything.
Yeah. I mean, I relate to this from the point of view of having been an entry-level employee in publishing and realizing so late that everybody, or well, not everybody, but an awful lot of people in my department and, you know, who I worked with were trust funders. And it was, you know, this realization that like, oh, that's how they can all afford to live in New York City on our paltry salaries of $28,000 a year. But what it would have been much better than having them acknowledge their privilege would have been if they paid us more.
Exactly. I mean, I think I was somewhat spared this from the path I took, while not necessarily higher paid, pretty similar. Somehow with grad school, I guess, I don't know. I think there were a lot of people just working side jobs, basically, and that was not stigmatized at all. It was kind of just, I mean, I think the professors didn't realize we were doing this, but so be it. It was pretty expensive living in New York even then. There was also an amazing, I don't know where this is even going to fit with this, that I had wanted to talk about, and I don't even know, where people acknowledge privilege that they don't have just out of some sort of force of habit. There was that Dear Prudence letter where the letter writer was like, my life is miserable, but I acknowledge my privilege. And it didn't make sense.
It was like, she had like 3 or 4 special needs
She
children.
had 4 kids. Okay, so this Dear Prudence letter writer, 4 kids, 3 with special needs, a dud of a husband who told her that she would get no alimony if they split up. She can't find work that pays enough, or like, that would pay enough for her to leave. She's in a bind, but she acknowledges her privilege.
Right.
And it was like, what privilege? Where is the privilege? And
I know this is a privileged position to be in. It's like, yes. How
what
is it?
Exactly. And I guess I find that very frustrating in, certainly in feminist writing in general, but here, this wasn't even a feminist point. It was just this kind of like meek, depressing situation where it's like, no, like, yeah, of course, there's always somebody worse off. And I guess this is this thing where this notion that because there are people who are worse off, it's somehow necessary, even if your situation is legitimately horrible, to make light of that, I just, that bothers me so much.
Yeah. I think this may have been a case just because of the kind of ideological standpoint of this particular Prudence, of the letter writer kind of doing it before somebody else did it to her, possibly.
I think that may be it. And I think that's often the case where I've written about it before is in feminist personal writing, but here as well could be where it's like, if you, what this was making me think of, and what's coming back to me is just like on, I keep bringing these up, and always in this vague way because they're private, but with like tens of thousands of people in them, but like online mom forums, where if you have any sort of advantage and you don't spell out that you are aware that you have such and such advantage, perhaps even with the letters TW and say privilege, like, trigger warning privilege or something like that, people will be very, very upset. And it could be something like, my life is in shambles, but I have dental insurance. You know what I mean? It could be something like that. And it's like, well, look at you. There are people whose life is in shambles and they don't have the dental insurance. You know what I mean? And I say this as somebody who long did not have dental insurance. But the point is, people always might have it worse, but I think it's more beneficial to solidarity and so forth, to sort of to lean into where something is going wrong for you. Really, like, you can then identify with people who also have it bad, who also have it worse, and find solutions rather than just saying, oh, well, like, buck up, basically. It ends up being a bootstraps thing, even if it seems sort of surfacey progressive. But yeah, that Dear Prudence letter writer, I just want to tell her, like, no, you are not privileged. But to their credit, Dear Prudence, so that's Daniel Mallory Ortberg, who, to be very clear, is not Dan Mallory, the Peacups
right
writer. Okay, these are 2 different people. So that's the new Prudence, and also some other letter writers there. We're not remotely checking this woman's privilege. Like, they were like finding ways out for her because clearly she was in a bad situation. So that I found reassuring.
Yes.
Not much else about it, but
still a line.
Yeah. I mean, I could, like, I have in front of me, like, all the things about privilege I've seen in the last however long, so I'm not going to do that because,
it's everywhere. Suffice to say that it's everywhere.
People just keep confessing to privilege apropos of nothing. They keep accusing one another of privilege apropos of nothing. One of the examples is somebody saying that if you have a supportive spouse, and especially if you are a man or a white woman, you should acknowledge your privilege about that. And it's like, yeah, that is luck, but is it privilege? And isn't it similarly luck no matter your background? And it was some whole thing. And I'm not going to start yelling at people on Twitter for something they tweeted where they were wrong on the internet like 3 weeks ago. But people are sometimes wrong on the internet 3 weeks ago, and I still remember. You have to, that's modern life.
Right. Who's going to hold them to account if not us on this podcast that none of those people will ever watch?
Not in a million years.
God. Sorry,
Is your sun? You're down south. You're in the southern.
Sunbeam has entered. Yeah, it's well,
we don't have that in Canada. Actually, yeah, no, not really. So 2 more things we have to cover though, because they're amazing. One is that there was an article also a few weeks ago about reply guys. I don't remember much about the article other than that it classifies the men who reply, how dare they, to women's tweets. Kat, is it okay if a man replies to your tweets?
Yes, it is. It's not okay though if he retweets me just because I'm a woman.
Exactly.
But yeah, sorry, this is really distracting. I had no idea this was going to happen. I'm going to try to kind of like get out of the. Oh, it's so bad.
It looks so sunny there.
It is. It's really.
I know it's frustrating. I remember sunshine, and I remember once being in Santa Barbara, trying to do work on a laptop and finding it too sunny, and thinking what a ridiculous problem that was.
Right. It always makes me feel a little guilty when even though it's freezing outside, when it's like this, and it makes me think of my mom being like, "It's a beautiful day. Why are you indoors? Why are you looking at a screen?" So I'm feeling really guilty right now, as I struggle to find a place that doesn't have the sun directly in my eyes.
Oh no!
All right, there. That's a little better.
That looks more comfortable.
Yes.
So reply guys are fine.
So reply guys, it's. This is one of these weird things where I do feel like it's kind of arbitrarily stigmatizing something that everybody does, but just saying that it's something that only men do, and I don't.
Yes, that's the issue with it. That is the issue with it that I also have. That basically, there are people who, because it's human interaction and it's not all like widgets. Some people tweet more. Some people reply to tweets more. Some people reply to one person's tweets a lot. Sometimes you have the people who reply a lot to your tweets. Sometimes because of things to do with the algorithm or whatever that I don't even understand. There are people, Twitter thinks reply to me too much, and I don't even think they do, but Twitter won't show me their replies. I don't know how that works.
That's weird.
Yeah. All sorts of things. I don't care if people reply to my tweets. Sometimes it's interesting. If it's uninteresting, I ignore it. I also sometimes reply to other people's tweets, and I am a woman.
Yeah, well, that's not allowed.
I don't know. I guess
female reply guys.
I guess it's like we talked about direct messaging versus like the sliding into DMs versus just messaging somebody. And I think the replies, I guess the reason those especially don't bother me is any interaction somebody has with me, and I'm not talking about if it's harassing, but if it's just whatever, at worst case scenario, the mansplaination. If it's something like, like this is something somebody's willing to say publicly. They're not trying to do something too creepy. It's so public, you know what I mean? And I feel like the incredibly public aspect of it makes it sort of the least frustrating. Yeah. Like they're not trying for a level of intimacy where like,
right. So actually I have something to say about this, which is, if we're going to stigmatize some kind, something that happens online or on Twitter specifically, I would much rather have it be this kind of like lectury moral policing that I am thinking of one person in particular who does this, who I'm not going to name, but
we speak in abstract terms.
So, the guys or, women, because I do definitely have some women who reply to a lot of my stuff. Sometimes it's worth engaging with and sometimes it's not. But when it's really about having a conversation and it's, or they just feel like they have something to contribute, like on a kind of a peer-to-peer level, like that, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And I don't want to stigmatize that just because sometimes men do it to women or men do it to women more. The thing that freaks me out is these certain people on the service who have sort of appointed themselves like the moral police who get to like kind of just decide or, come after you depending on how you are talking on your own timeline about things.
Yes.
And
yes. And I know what you mean. And I think what always confuses me about this is that I just have a lot of trouble telling, and I guess this just maybe I'm not sufficiently online, even though I feel quite online. But maybe not. Sometimes I just can't even tell with individual people doing this how much power they have. Like there was some whole thing, and this is maybe like very niche Canadian at this point, but where it was something about like, if you write for some publication, like, we know you do that, you know what I'm talking about, probably.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And it was like,
if you're an academic writing for, can we
Quillette,
say
yeah, it was like if you write, but I think it was
watching
like,
you.
and it just was like, I don't have enough of a sense of any of the sort of parties here to know whether this is coming from somebody who has power over what, or whether the power is more in the other direction. And because it seems like this person was then retweeted by some very far right person in Canada, not somebody from Quillette, who then got probably trolls so it all seemed like a big mess where everybody's, there's a lot of horribleness on all sides. But just when people do that kind of moral policing thing, I never have any sense of what power they actually have and how much of it is like the power they wish they had. Like, where it's this tone of kind of like, well, we all know that you're bad. And it's like, but it could just be this one person with 3 followers and nobody, you know what I mean? Like there's just this kind of tone. It's
so presumptuous. And there's this thing where, and I do find that men do this more than women, but maybe it's just me, where they appear and they're like, I demand that you debate me, or apologize to me for having expressed yourself.
Yeah, I demand that you debate me is certainly, I'm going to say that's a man thing. I don't know if a woman has ever said that, except in the context of like an actual debate of some sort.
I'm thinking about this particular interaction that I had where, somebody appeared kind of demanding apologies for his, particular interpretation of something that I'd written. And I just basically said, no, I'm not interested in doing this with you because you're notorious for bad faith engagement, basically. And this man replied, "It must be amazing to always be a victim."
Oh dear. Well, I think this gets it. Okay, so this gets at my theory of, so this is super abstract. We're leaping to the super abstract here, but social justice ease as like a form of speech. And I feel like both, like, 2 things can happen with this. One is that people can say fairly innocuous things, or for instance, write like a fairly innocuous academic paper, and then people on the right will jump on it, like, look at what these, like PC liberals, blah blah blah, But also, it can be this sort of policing thing where a certain tone online can just come across as like really hyperbolic, really judgmental, like where like raising the stakes of some petty disagreements among people who basically agree with each other on politics to some kind of huge, like, this person should be banished, level. And I think that's some of what goes on online. It's just this tone where like certain words are used and it just signals that that's what's happening.
Yes. I think in cases when that happens, it's usually it's no longer aimed actually at the person who's on the receiving end of the comment, but at the people who are watching, who
or who they hope are watching.
Right. It's supposed to be kind of a performative thing. But I'm always struck by the like inappropriately intimate nature of comments like that, where it's like, this would be over the line coming from anybody who didn't know me intimately in real life, and coming from a stranger on the internet. It's like, it's very weird.
No, I get that. And you know what? This is making me think of something that, it's not that I think it should be banished, and I think people probably do this all the time and I don't care. But sometimes if people use my first name, and especially if it's people who I don't know who they are, and they use a pseudonym. Sometimes people use a pseudonym and I know who they are, but people might not know that I know who they are. So like, this kind of hard to tell from the outside. But where it's like this sort of like false intimacy, and there's this asymmetry, and where they want me to really like say where I stand on this or that. And often I will not even have slept, and thus will not have read the article in question, whatever. But yeah, there's something about that. And I feel like it is maybe more men who do that, but I'm not entirely sure. Sure. And I do not have the whole internet as a sample here. I'm going by my own fairly limited experiences of this. But yeah, so reply. I think it's fine if people reply. They should just not be obnoxious.
Yes. I mean, I would take a million reply guys any day of the week over that kind of interaction.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So we had, oh boy, we're late. It's late. I don't know if we're gonna.
I think we should probably call, because I can't find a place that's not in the sun, and
I think
my dog is crying and crying in the other room.
We will leave the Feminine Chaos viewers and listeners wondering what that other topic was.
Right. Wanting more.
Yes. Next time.
All right. Thanks for chatting with me.
Thank you, Kat.
Thank you, Phoebe. must be nice to always be a victim.
It's fabulous. All right.
This has been Feminine Chaos.
Yeah. See you next time.